Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive into a topic near and dear to my heart, the history of RPGs.
A history that's surprisingly deep, I might add. We're going to uncover some fascinating stories today.
Absolutely. And luckily for us, we've got not one, but two fantastic articles by RPG historian Paul Bellow to guide us.
Oh, Paul's really done his homework. Beyond the Main Quest and RPG History Timeline offer a really comprehensive look at how we got from simple war games to the immersive RPG experiences we know and love today.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How did we get from moving little soldiers around a board to battling dragons in fantastical realms? It all starts with something you might not expect: wargaming.
It's true. Before Knights and Dragons captured our imaginations, there were those tiny soldiers and meticulously recreated historical battles. Paul actually mentions H.G. Wells's Little Wars from 1913.
Little Wars? I have to admit, I'd never heard of it either.
It's a fascinating little piece of history, considered by many to be a very early example of what would eventually become the tabletop wargaming hobby. And it's important because it gave us the basic structure that RPGs would later adapt. Rules, strategy, the whole idea of simulating conflict within a system.
That's fascinating, but it still seems like a huge leap from, say, recreating the Battle of Waterloo to imagining yourself as a knight fighting a dragon. How did fantasy even enter the picture?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Games like Chainmail, which Paul talks about extensively, started introducing fantasy elements into the wargaming mix. We're talking knights, wizards, mythical creatures.
Yeah.
Suddenly, those historical battles were getting a fantastical makeover.
So basically, the same structure, but with a fantasy reskin.
Exactly. But here's where Chainmail gets really groundbreaking. Instead of just controlling massive armies, players were given control of individual characters. This was a huge shift because it paved the way for something we now consider essential to RPGs: storytelling.
I see where you're going with this. Now, it's not just about strategy, it's about the story of that individual character, their strengths, their weaknesses, their motivations.
And that brings us to the real game changer, the one that truly ignited the RPG phenomenon as we know it. 1974, Dungeons & Dragons bursts onto the scene.
D&D, the granddaddy of them all.
And Paul calls it a revolution, which honestly is spot on. D&D brilliantly took that structure from wargaming, added those fantasy elements that Chainmail had introduced, and focused on individual character development. But then it added one more element that would change everything: the Dungeon Master.
The legendary DM. Okay, for anyone who's never experienced the joy of a tabletop RPG, what exactly does a Dungeon Master do?
The Dungeon Master is the heart of the game. Imagine a narrator, a referee, and the architect of the game world, all rolled into one. They describe the world, control the monsters, the NPCs, non-player characters, for those new to the lingo, and keep the game running smoothly.
So they're basically like a god of this world that the players are inhabiting?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But they're also collaborators. Dungeon Masters improvise, they react to the player's choices, and they weave the player's actions into a living, breathing story. That's what truly sets D&D apart.
This collaborative storytelling aspect, right?
Exactly. D&D wasn't just about rolling dice and slaying monsters. It was about the emergent narratives, the shared experiences, and the stories that you created together. And that resonated with people in a huge way.
But as influential as D&D was, it was really just the beginning. The floodgates had opened, and a whole wave of creativity was about to wash over the RPG world.
And thank goodness for that. It's easy to forget with how iconic D&D has become, but this era gave birth to some of the most beloved RPGs of all time, and they were all wildly different.
It's funny to think about, but in the late 70s and early 80s, tabletop RPGs were kind of like the Wild West.
The perfect analogy. D&D has shown everyone what was possible, and game designers were eager to explore new ideas, new settings, new way of playing.
Paul calls this period the golden age of tabletop RPGs, and it's easy to see why. We're talking spaceships, cosmic horror, even ancient mythology all getting the RPG treatment. Paul specifically points to games like Traveler, Call of Cthulhu, and RuneQuest as shining examples of this era.
And this is where things get really interesting for us, I think. These games weren't just reskinning D&D with a different coat of paint. They brought genuinely new mechanics and ideas to the table. Ideas that, honestly, we're still feeling the impact of today.
Okay, so spill the tea. What
Yeah.
kind of new mechanics are we talking about here?
We'll take Traveler, for example.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about creating a hero and throwing them into dungeons. It was about exploring a vast, sprawling galaxy. You could be a trader, a diplomat, a space pirate. The game really leaned into the idea that you could forge your own path, that your character's destiny wasn't predetermined.
It's interesting that you bring up Traveler because when I think about some of the most celebrated modern RPGs, that freedom of choice, that ability to really shape your character's story, it's front and center.
Exactly. And that's something Traveler really pioneered. But the innovations didn't stop there. Call of Cthulhu, for instance, took a completely different approach. Inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, it introduced this brilliant and terrifying new mechanic: sanity.
Wait, so encountering a monster could actually make your character go insane. How did they even represent that mechanically?
It was genius, really.
Hmm.
You had this sanity stat that could be reduced when your character witnessed something particularly horrific. And as your sanity dwindled, your character could start to experience hallucinations, phobias, even completely break down. It added this whole psychological layer to the game that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before.
So it wasn't just about gaining levels and collecting loot. Your character's mental state, their very perception of reality, became a crucial part of the game.
Precisely. And this exploration of darker themes, of moral ambiguity and flawed characters, it really started to flourish during this era. Vampire,
Yeah.
the Masquerade, is another fantastic example. Combat, which is so central to many RPGs, took a backseat to personal horror, intrigue, and the complexities of navigating this shadowy supernatural underworld.
I've heard Vampire the Masquerade described as more of a supernatural soap opera than a dungeon crawl. All this is fascinating stuff, truly innovative stuff. But we're still talking about tabletop games, right? Dice,
Yeah.
character sheets, that whole deal.
Right. But remember, while this was all unfolding, something else was happening in the world: the rise of personal computers. And it wasn't long before these two worlds, tabletop gaming and the digital realm, would collide in a big way.
Cue the 8-bit soundtracks. I remember playing some of those early computer RPGs. Even with those pixelated graphics, the idea that you could actually explore a dungeon, fight monsters in real time, it was mind-blowing.
It was a seismic shift for the world of RPGs. Paul talks about a game called Akalabeth from 1979. It's considered one of the very first computer RPGs, a sort of proto-Ultima, which would go on to become a legendary franchise.
I actually spent countless hours playing Ultima back in the day.
And that was just the beginning. But before we jump into the world of computer RPGs, there's another crucial piece of the puzzle we need to discuss, one that might surprise you. Remember those text-based adventures that were all the rage in the early days of home computers? Games like Zork.
Oh, absolutely. You mean where you'd type commands like go north or open door? They sound so archaic now, but at the time, those games were incredibly immersive. You had to use your imagination to fill in the blanks, and the stories they told could be surprisingly engaging.
They were, and far more influential than many people realize. Believe it or not, those text-based adventures were the seeds from which online RPGs would eventually sprout. They evolved into these fascinating online communities called MUDs, multi-user dungeons.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. What exactly a MUD? Paint me a picture.
Imagine playing a game like Zork, but instead of exploring this world solo, you're doing it with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other players, all in real time. You'd create a character, choose a class, and then venture forth into the shared virtual world. You could chat with other players, team up to complete quests, battle monsters, even engage in player versus player combat.
Wow. So we're talking about the very earliest incarnations of what would become massively multiplayer online RPGs. MMOs, as we know them.
Precisely. And it all started with those seemingly simple text-based adventures. It's amazing how these things evolve, isn't it?
It really is. But while this online revolution was simmering in the background, some of the biggest RPG franchises we know and love today were just starting to find their footing. Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, even The Legend of Zelda, while not strictly an RPG, borrows heavily from the genre.
Absolutely. These games, particularly Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, introduced a generation of gamers to the magic of RPGs and proved that these games could be more than just niche hobbies. They could be global phenomena.
And that brings us to the 1990s, a time when RPGs really hit the mainstream. It was the era of the RPG boom. But it was also a time when a clear divide began to emerge. JRPGs, those Japanese role-playing games that captured the imaginations of millions, and Western RPGs, which offered their own distinct flavor.
A fascinating dichotomy.
Yeah.
One that's still debated and discussed today. And to truly understand this divide, we need to look no further than what is arguably the most iconic JRPG of all time, Final Fantasy VII.
I remember when that game came out, it was a cultural event. Even people who had never touched an RPG before were swept up in the hype.
Rightfully so. It was a groundbreaking game in so many ways. It really was. It had this incredible story, these unforgettable characters, those mind-blowing cinematic cutscenes for the time. But what really sets it apart as a JRPG as opposed to, say, a Western RPG?
That's the million-gill question, isn't it? When we talk about JRPGs, particularly those that came out of that golden age, we often see this strong emphasis on narrative, almost like playing through an interactive anime. Epic storylines, memorable characters, often with a distinct visual style. And in terms of gameplay, turn-based combat was, and still is, a defining characteristic.
Which is a stark contrast to what was happening in the West at the time.
Absolutely. While Japan was crafting these grand character-driven adventures, Western developers were taking RPGs in a different direction. You had games like Baldur's Gate, which stayed true to that classic D&D formula, isometric perspective, party-based, incredibly deep lore.
Baldur's Gate was a game that demanded patience, strategic thinking, a willingness to really lose yourself in its world.
It did. And then on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, you had Diablo, which was all about fast-paced action, hordes of enemies, and of course that addictive loot loop.
Oh, yeah?
And we can't forget about Morrowind. It wasn't just an RPG. It was a whole world to get lost in. I think I spent more time exploring that game's world than I did actually following the main quest.
Morrowind is a perfect example of what many Western RPGs began to prioritize. Open-world design, player freedom, and intricate systems that gave you the tools to craft your own experience. Whether it was the classic RPG like Baldur's Gate, an action RPG like Diablo, or a vast open world like Morrowind, Western RPGs tended to emphasize choice, consequence, and giving the player agency.
And then, just as these two distinct styles were solidifying, the internet came along and changed everything. We talked about those early MUDs, those text-based precursors to online RPGs, but the late 90s was when things really exploded. Suddenly, we weren't just exploring digital worlds, we were inhabiting them alongside thousands of other players.
The rise of the MMO, the massively multiplayer online RPG, was nothing short of a revolution. And it all started with a game called Ultima Online. The ambition was staggering for the time. Thousands of players, all inhabiting this shared, persistent world. You could chat with other players, form guilds, even buy and sell virtual goods. It was groundbreaking.
Ultima Online really was the Wild West of online gaming, wasn't it?
It really was. But as Paul points out in his articles, Ultima Online wasn't without its growing pains. There were technical challenges, balancing issues, even players finding creative ways to exploit the system.
So those early MMOs, they were as much about the social experiment as they were about the games themselves.
Absolutely. But then came a game that would refine the MMO formula, and in many ways set the standard for all that would follow, EverQuest. It emphasized group challenges, large-scale raids, and that sense of community and camaraderie that keeps players coming back year after year.
From typing Go North in a text-based MUD to leading a raid against a dragon with 40 of your closest friends. The evolution of RPGs never ceases to amaze me.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And it didn't stop there. The 21st century has seen RPGs evolve in ways we could only have dreamed of just a few decades ago. Games like Skyrim and The Witcher 3 pushed the boundaries of open-world design, creating these massive, breathtaking worlds that felt truly alive. And it wasn't just about size. These games were filled with meaningful choices, complex characters, and stories that could rival the best fantasy novels.
But open worlds were just one part of the equation, right? We've also seen this incredible resurgence of narrative-driven RPGs, games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, where your choices had a real impact on the story, and the line between game and interactive narrative became wonderfully blurred.
You're absolutely right. And let's not forget the indie developers who've brought so much innovation and creativity to the genre. Games like Undertale, Hades, and Disco Elysium have shown us that you don't need a massive budget or a huge team to tell an unforgettable story or create a truly unique RPG experience.
It's incredible to think how far we've come from wargaming with tiny soldiers to these sprawling, emotionally resonant digital worlds. It makes you wonder, where do RPGs go from here? What's next?
Well, Paul touches on some exciting possibilities in his articles. Virtual reality and augmented reality are already starting to change how we experience games. Imagine a future where you can truly step into a fantasy world, where your living room transforms into a dungeon, and you can interact with these fantastical characters face to face.
That's not even getting into the potential of AI to create dynamic, ever-changing worlds and characters that respond to our choices in truly unpredictable ways.
The possibilities are mind-blowing. But no matter how technology shapes the future of RPGs, one thing is certain: that spirit of adventure, of shared storytelling, of losing yourself in these fantastical worlds, That's what lies at the heart of RPGs, and that's something that will never go out of style.
It's been an absolute pleasure taking this deep dive into RPG history with you today. For our listeners, I can't recommend Paul Bellow's articles enough. Beyond the Main Quest and RPG History Timeline, they're full of fascinating insights that we didn't even have time to cover today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real treat.
And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. With all these incredible advancements in technology, will the future of RPGs blur the lines between reality and fantasy even further? Until next time, keep exploring, keep rolling those dice, and keep those imaginations firing.